So in most parts of the country, it is spawn or post spawn. And what happens after the bass spawn is the shad spawn. And so today what I want to talk about is the baits that I use in a shad spawn that you should have in your boat, and some of the key features that you need to know about where to find a shad spawn and how to go about targeting it. So stick around, you guys are not gonna want to miss this video. So a shad spawn is probably one of the most fun bites of the entire year for the fun fact that you can get on a ton of fish in a short time frame. But the downfall is it is first thing in the morning. But when you get on it, it can be a gangbuster, catch 20 pounds, catch a ton of fish, have a great time. But if you don't know what baits to throw, you can find yourself trying to figure out what baits to throw in the midst of it, and before you know it, the shad are already done spawning and it's game over. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna break down the baits that I keep on the deck, and basically the only baits that I'm gonna throw during a shad spawn. So my number one bait for a shad spawn is going to be a jerk bait. I throw that 6 cents provoke, and I throw it in very natural shad colors. I will go from natural shad to a white if you get overcast and windy conditions, but those are gonna be the colors that I am gonna throw because that's what's gonna make your bait stick out from the rest of the shad. Because when you have a shad spawn, you have a ton of shad in a very small area, and those bass are just on the outside of it or just gangbusting them as they're coming through. And so if you can make your bait stick out a little bit, make it look different, that's gonna be key. And none does that better than a jerk bait because you have that darting, diving action, and it looks like a wounded shad in the midst of all these other shad, and it makes for an easy pickings meal. So the next bait that I throw when I'm around a shad spawn is going to be a spinner bait. And you can supplement a chatterbait in here too, but I really like that spinner bait because it's basically like a mini A-rig. And so you have all these blades that imitate all of the shad. And so when you know you're throwing the right baits, especially with a spinner bait, is you will have a ton of shad following it in. Whether you have 1 or 2, or whether you have 10 or 15, that's how you know how good your shad spawn is versus if it's staying there or if it's leaving. And so that's what I usually pick up first is a spinnerbait because it draws those shad with it. And that's how I know that I'm around a shad spawn. That's really critical to me. And then if I notice I'm not getting bit on this, that's when I go to the jerkbait. But that spinnerbait does such a good job at just looking like a ball of shad that you get some of the most incredible aggressive strikes possible on this. And I generally just throw a little split tail trailer on there, nothing crazy. But that is my go-to when I'm first trying to figure out if there's a shad spawn. The key to note when you're throwing a spinnerbait is if you start feeling like they're slapping at the bait, because you can feel it when they slap at it. A lot of times they'll swat at the blades, they'll swat at the bait themselves. Make sure you have trailer hooks in the boat. That is super key, especially if you have really clean water and you feel like, man, they're just swatting at it. That's when I will always pick up that trailer hook and put that on there. When you don't need a trailer hook is if you notice all of your fish are gagging on it, like bait is engulfed, then you can take it off because sometimes it can get in the way of the fish trying to eat the whole bait. But a trailer hook is gonna be one of those deals that I always have with me, and generally always have a couple spinner baits rigged up with it, just because on the off chance they start swatting at it, I'm gonna make sure I always put that on there because it can save you a lot of fish. As far as colors and blade combinations with the spinnerbait, I like to stick to a natural shad. You can see here I have the Z-Man sling blades, and I always use willow leaf blades, and I like to go with silver. You'll notice this one has a small gold or copper on there. I'm not really too concerned about that, but the willow leaf is the important part on there because it replicates the motion of that shad and you can move it a lot faster. Now, if you're fishing dirty water, that's one thing, but if you're in any kind of relatively clear water, always put those willow leaf blades on there because that's what's gonna give you the best success, and that's what's gonna allow you to cover the most water. Because that's really key when you have a shad spawn, is figuring out the areas that those shad are spawning and then just covering water and trying to trigger as many fish as possible in as little a time as possible, because you only have till that sun gets high in the sky and then it's over with. So the last bait, and I mean the last bait, I don't throw many baits when it comes to a shad spawn, is going to be a swim jig. That is key is a swim jig because that works great when you're fishing around cover. We're out here on the Coosa River, you have all that water willow, that grass. That's one of the baits that works the best around cover. And I will generally pair that with a Z-Man goat or a Z-Man bat wings or a chunk style trailer. If you're a guy that likes to put the action in it, if you like to shake it, go with a flatter style trailer, is like basically like a chunk style trailer, a meaty chunk of Z-Man bat wings. But if you're a guy that likes to reel it and barely put a little bit of action into it, I like to go with the Z-Man Goat because it has the tails kicking on there. But this allows me to fish in cover, and this again is that 6th Sense Divine Swim jig. I'll have all of it linked down below like I always do. This is a bait that you can just cover a lot of water, fish it really, really weedless, and trigger bites in that cover, because when you cast it, you can be hopping it and popping it through all of that grass, that vegetation, the laydowns, wherever you happen to be fishing, without getting your baits hung up, which is super, super important. A lot of times this will even work really good when you're fishing open water hydrilla, if you're fishing really, really thick hydrilla. And that's one of those situations when you're in hydrilla where you could also put in a chatterbait with this, but a lot of times these are the 3 baits that I'm gonna stick with. Again, if you're in thick hydrilla, a white chatterbait does an extremely good job, but that's the only exception to all of these other baits. I don't add in any swim baits. I don't add in anything crazy. Generally, those are the baits that I throw because they're feeding so heavily during a shad spawn. You want to have moving baits that are going to trigger the biggest fish in there, and you're going to want to cover as much water as physically possible during that low light period. Now that you kind of know the baits, let's talk about what a shad spawn is and where you're going to want to target a shad spawn and kind of some of the ins and outs of it. So with a shad spawn, what happens is those shads start to spawn at night. That is their key time. They spawn at night for the most part, and we as anglers only catch the remnants of it, the last little bit, first thing in the morning. A key thing to note is if you get extremely strong winds at night, that can shut a shad spawn down, as well as thunderstorms. However, on the flip side of that, if you get overcast and rain without any crazy winds, it can also prolong a shad spawn. The longer it stays low light periods, the darker it stays longer, the better the shad spawn is going to be and the more fish you're gonna catch. That being said, if you have clear skies and bluebird skies the next day, that shad spawn is only gonna last maybe 45 minutes to an hour first thing in the morning. So if you don't capitalize on it really, really fast, you're gonna miss out on it almost immediately. Which is why, if you notice, I only have a couple of baits that I like to throw with it because you don't get to play with it all day. Those fish are feeding and then they shut off. Where you find a shad spawn, this is really, really important. Where you find a shad spawn is you want to stay almost as main lake as physically possible. Main lake or main bay, if there's a really big bay that kicks off of the main lake, you want to stay as close to that as you physically can. Those shad do not want to go back into pockets to spawn, because that's what happens is those bass will pin them back there and you don't find it very often. And so what you want to look for is hydrilla edges. They will spawn on the edge of hydrilla. They will spawn on the edge of hard grasses, whether that be cattails, lily pads, water willow, etc. Docks, they spawn on docks. Basically hard cover. Another really good one is riprap, chunky rock. They will spawn on that as well. And then when you get down south, they spawn on red clay a lot. So you want to look for hard bottom and hard objects that are in the water. That's what they lay their eggs on. Their eggs stick to that, and that's what they will be rubbing up against. That's why you'll notice when you see it, those fish will be like flopping out of the water onto those hard objects, which it's super, super fun to see that. But a lot of times you don't see it because most of the activity is under the water. Now, when you're fishing a shad spawn, you will notice that right after the shad spawn is over, when the sun comes up, everything shuts off. That's because those fish just had a full course meal all night, and you're gonna have a slow midday period. The bite will pick up in the afternoon, but as far as that midday period from about 8 o'clock till about noon or 1, the bite is going to be completely dead, and it is gonna suck. So you have to keep that in mind going into this period, because if you don't, you're gonna think everything sucks, and it does, but you have to know that going into it. So another thing to note is just because the shad spawned there last night doesn't mean they're necessarily going to spawn there again the next night. You have to know that shad spawn is something that continuously will be moving around. No, they won't go far though. So keep that in mind when you're looking for a shad spawn, and keep that area in mind, and just look for more hard objects, more cover that they might want to spawn on. So hopefully this helps you guys figure out a shad spawn and catch more fish on a shad spawn. For more tips like this, hit that subscribe button to follow along. But God bless every single one of you guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.